So just spread out a little bit, give yourself some space, because after I read this, I want you to spend some quality time with this. All right, that's what the point of all this is. All right. All right, so you can go to your next page in your journal, and you can put today's date at the top, which is January 19th, 2022. And if you want to put a title to it, it's called The Struggles of Our Life. Once upon a time, a daughter complained to her father that her life was miserable and that she didn't know how she was going to make it. She was tired of fighting and struggling all the time. It seemed just as one problem was solved, another one soon followed. Her father, a chef, took her to the kitchen. He filled 3 pots with water and placed each on a high fire. Once the 3 pots began to boil, he placed potatoes in one pot, eggs in the second pot, and ground coffee beans in the third pot. He then let them sit and boil. Without saying a word to his daughter, the daughter moaned and impatiently waited, wondering what he was doing. After 20 minutes, he turned off the burners. He took the potatoes out of the pot and placed them in a bowl. He pulled the eggs out and placed them in a bowl. Then he ladled the coffee out and placed it in a cup. Turning to her, he asked, "Daughter, what do you see?" "Potatoes, eggs, and coffee," she hastily replied. "Look closer," he said, "and touch the potatoes." She did and noted that they were soft. He then asked her to take an egg and break it. After pulling off the shell, she observed the hard-boiled egg. Finally, he asked her to sip the coffee. Its rich aroma brought a smile to her face. "Father, what does this mean?" she asked. He then explained that the potatoes, the eggs, and coffee beans had each faced the same adversity, the boiling water. However, each one reacted differently. The potato went in strong, hard, and unrelenting, but in boiling water it became soft and weak. The egg was fragile, with the thin outer shell protecting its liquid interior until it was put in the boiling water. Then the inside of the egg became hard. However, the ground coffee beans were unique. After they were exposed to the boiling water, they changed the water and created something new. "Which one are you?" he asked his daughter. "When adversity knocks on your door, how do you respond? Are you a potato, an egg, or a coffee bean?" So the moral is, in life, things happen around us, things happen to us, but the only thing that truly matters is how you choose to react to it and what you make out of it. Life is all about learning, Life is all about learning, adopting, and converting all the struggles that we experience into something positive. So take a couple minutes and think about that and maybe how it relates to your life. So some of you guys found out it's kind of hard to sit in silence for 10 minutes. There was some, I don't remember who it's attributed to, but there's someone that once said most of the world's problems could be dealt with effectively if man would learn to sit by himself alone and quietly in a room for 1 hour. And there's some people, like Father Mike Schmidt says, he says if that person could sit alone quietly in a room with the Lord for an hour, most of the world's problems would be solved. Because we wouldn't be able to keep it all this angst in. And I think part of the problem is that when we sit in silence, there's all these distractions in our mind and something like that. And sometimes it reveals something about ourselves. And a lot of times, I know for me, it reveals things about myself I don't want to face. But like how impatient I am and how I can't calm down and how I can't be at peace and things like that. And so we have to face that kind of stuff. So that's why time in silence, whenever you get it, is a really good opportunity. Because unless you take that time for silence at home, it isn't going to happen. And you can, as most of you can attest to at home, there's so many distractions. You got brothers and sisters, or someone's always got the TV on, or something else is going on, or you got earbuds in, whatever it happens to be. Just taking time for that silence can be really important. And I'm not saying start with an hour, but start with 5 or 10 minutes and see what a difference it makes. And that's a good lead into our saint for tonight. We're going to talk about St. Vincent de Paul. And how many of you guys have heard of St. Vincent de Paul before? I mean, most of you have heard the name St. Vincent de Paul, right? But we probably don't know a lot about him, okay? So we've heard of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and the St. Vincent de Paul Society, which, you know, does a lot of good. It's a great outlet for, you know, Catholic charities in all over the world. And that was a result of St. Vincent de Paul. Obviously, it was named after him. We'll talk about him at the end a little bit about that, but it wasn't actually formed by him, right? But it was inspired by him. So Vincent de Paul, he was born in 1581. And again, this is one of those time periods in history, like 1581, I don't know anything that's going on then. But this is a tumultuous time in Europe. And so there's like a lot of, you know, now you look at the map of Europe and maybe you see 30 countries or so. This is a time of a bunch of little kingdoms and a bunch of little, just basically little places that are all in conflict with each other. And you've got some larger areas like in France and Spain, but you also have a lot of just localities who are in conflict with each other. And so Vincent is born in this little town in southwestern France called Puy, I think is how it's pronounced. It's near another town called Dax. Neither are places that you've probably ever heard before. But very close to the border of Spain, very close to the Bay of Biscay, up on the southwestern part of France. And he was one of 6 kids. There was 3 other brothers and 2 sisters that he had. I believe he was the 3rd child. And he was a really smart kid from early on. But he was the one that the dad sent out to be the shepherd in the field. And the neighbors came and they said, "Why are you sending him out there? This kid's smart. He could do something good for your family. You've got some other sons who aren't going to amount to much, you know, because they're causing trouble and things." So he says, "You should have them do the shepherding and send this one off to school." And so the father kind of took that to heart, and he scraped together a little bit of money. They were just a peasant family, poor farmers. And he managed to do that, send him to a school in Dax nearby. Vincent, he excelled, so much so that he was asked to tutor other kids. And this worked out really well for him, because once he got to be about 16 years old and he was going to go off to Toulouse, which is a large city about 100 miles from there, you know, they were trying to scrape money together for this, and it was really difficult to do that. So he began tutoring, and so this was a way for him to generate income so that he could go to college. And so he worked his way through college. He was tutoring full-time and he was going to school full-time. And so this was quite an achievement, because there weren't a lot of people that were doing that at the time. You either had money and were going to school, or you didn't go to school. That was basically your choices. And so he excelled. By the time he was about 19, they wanted to ordain him to the priesthood, but you couldn't become ordained to become a priest until you were 24. And so he had just been such a shining example to people. So he, you know, so he just went on and he did some more studying. Around 1605, so when he's about 24 or so, he gets ordained. And most of the time, people became priests at that time because it was a way out of poverty. And so you would go become the priest of a parish, and the people in town would support you, and it was, you know, then you could then support your family back home. And a lot of the people weren't very well formed. They were doing it for the money. And that was something that Vincent, he was doing because he knew this, and he had a great love of God. And so, most of the times when a priest was ordained, they'd have this big ornate mass, and basically it was kind of a signal to everybody that, hey, we got this new priest, and you know, who wants him, kind of thing. But Vincent, he was so humble. He's like, no, I don't want that. He had this little chapel out in the woods that he knew of, and he and 2 other people went out there and had his first mass. And it said, in trembling and in fear, he celebrated his first mass, knowing the gravity of what he was doing, and not feeling himself worthy as a human being to be able to do this. So this was very different from most of the other people that were ordained at the time. So anyway, he did find his way into a little bit of money. There was a woman that left him a small fortune, and so he had to go off to try and claim this fortune. It was like, I don't know what the values are. It said 400 to 500 crowns. Excuse me. There was a fortune, but she was owed 400 to 500 crowns from somebody else. So he inherited this person that owed this woman money. So this guy going, hey, the woman died. He scoots off to Marseille, which is on the other side of France, and he says, you know, I'm free of this debt. Well, Vincent goes, not so fast. And he basically tracks him down in Marseille and negotiates with him and gets 300 of the crowns back. So that he's able to have a little bit so he could send some to his family, and so he has something to live on as well. Well, he was with a friend, and his friend said, you know, let's, rather than going back by land, it's cheaper if we take the sea route along the coast and then cut inland. It's shorter and it's cheaper, so let's go that way. So they said, all right, so they do this. And when they're out going along the coast, one of the things that's going on at the time is there's a lot of pirates. A lot of Turkish and Muslim pirates that are out basically raiding ships. And this was during a time of a big festival. And so they knew there was a lot of ships that had a lot of goods on them and a lot of things that people had sold goods and made a lot of money. So all of a sudden they realized that they're being followed by 3 of these pirate ships, and there's no way to get away from them. And so basically they're boarded, and there's a big fight, that, you know, battle that breaks out. And basically everybody on board, with the exception of Vincent and a couple other people, are killed. And they said basically that when they did take the ship, the pirates that took the ship, they chopped the captain to bits. So they literally hacked his body to bits, you know, just because they were so angry, because they had taken a lot of casualties too. So what they did with the survivors is they were going to take them back and sell them into slavery. So again, if you know your geography, the Mediterranean Sea is there in France, and Europe is all up on the top of the Mediterranean Sea. They took them down to North Africa, to Tunis, and they were going to sell them as slaves there. And so they had taken some other captives, and so they go down to Tunis, and basically Vincent is sold into slavery. He's sold to a fisherman at first, but then he gets seasick, so the fisherman says, well, I got a bad deal, sells him to another guy. That guy dies, and his nephew sells him away to this other guy who is a Frenchman, who had apostatized and had become a Muslim. And so, he became a Muslim because if he would have apostatized, they would say, okay, fine, you can now live amongst us as one of us. And so he had gotten into some money. He had 3 wives. He was living the high life now simply because he had denied his Christian faith. Well, he was out working, he wound up with Vincent. And so Vincent's out working in the field, and one of the wives hears this singing out there. And so she goes out in the field and hears Vincent singing some hymns and some various songs, and she's enjoying what she's hearing. She says, you know, sing some more from your heritage. And she realizes that he comes from a very beautiful heritage, and he's singing these hymns, and he's singing like the Regina Coeli, and he's singing all these beautiful hymns, and it brings her to tears. And she's a Muslim. And so she goes back to her husband, who she knew was once Christian, and she says, how could you ever leave this faith with such beauty in it, right? And he kind of had been away for quite a while, but that question kind of sat on his heart for a while. And after a few days, he realized he had made a mistake. And so he went to Vincent and he said, you know, someday there'll be a time when we can escape from here. And he says, then I'll take you with me. And it took about 9 or 10 months till they had an opportunity, but they got a boat, and the 2 of them, I don't know why he didn't take his wives, maybe they didn't want to go, but this guy and Vincent, they steal a boat and they make it back to France. And so this other guy, he winds up coming back to the church, and it was just this air that Vincent had about him, right? He was able to show the beauty of the Catholic faith to this Muslim woman who knew nothing about it. And so then that wore off on her husband, and he winds up basically leaving this life of luxury he had and coming back to the church. And so this, so Vincent, but he was gone 2 years. So that's 1607 now, but he gets back, and people were pretty intrigued by the whole story. And so he winds up, in front of the King of France, basically saying, and the Pope. Or it said Rome, so I'm assuming the Pope. But they're basically, kind of wanting to know how, what had happened to him. So he didn't like all this notoriety. He just kind of wanted to get out. So he's in Paris. He's kind of like, I want to get away from this place because I don't want this. And so he winds up leaving Paris, and he meets up with a gentleman who was a priest. His name was Father de Beirut. I'm butchering the French, but this man, he was forming this French confraternity of the Oratory, which I think is an offshoot of St. Philip Neri, who we'll learn about a little bit in a few weeks. But he's forming this, and he could spot right away that Vincent was a pretty holy guy. He knew that his humility was genuine. He knew that there was a holiness and an air about him, that there was something real to him, and they became close friends. And so, but Vincent didn't have a place to live, and so they make arrangements for him to live in this place with this guy who's a judge, who happened to be from the same region where Vincent was from. Well, Vincent fell ill, and he was waiting for someone to deliver some medicine, and the judge had to go out and run some errands. So anyway, the guy comes to deliver the medicine, and he goes to get a glass out of the cupboard for Vincent to take a drink out of, and he sees this purse of money in there, which happened to belong to the judge. And so this delivery guy basically takes the money. All right. So he gives Vincent the medicine, and he leaves. The judge comes back, and he sees the money gone, and he's like, Vincent, why did you take my money? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He says, God knows what happened. I have nothing to do with it. And the guy just started berating him, and he went outside to the police, and he tried to report him to the police. The police were like, there's no proof of this. And so finally, he's going around town, he's telling everybody, Vincent took my money. He goes back to this Father de Beirut, and he's like, he just didn't believe him. He's like, I know Vincent. Vincent's not that kind of guy. There's something else. There's another part of the story. Well, it turns out that this guy that took the money 6 months later is on his deathbed and confesses the whole thing. And so he goes and he apologizes to Vincent and the judge. And the judge is he's just beside himself. He's like, please just forgive me. I'll beg you forgiveness on my knees. And Vincent's like, just don't talk about it anymore. It's fine. You're forgiven. I've moved on. And so he didn't want all this, he didn't want all this notoriety. He didn't want all this, he wasn't going to make a big deal of it. It was just the way he was. And so they were getting ready to assign him to a parish, and they actually had assigned him to a parish, but no sooner had they done that than a friend of the priest, Father de Beirut, had another person who wanted a tutor for their children. And it was somebody very high up in the pecking order. It was a Count de Gondi was his name. And him and his wife, they had these two boys. And the Count and the Countess, they were very pious people. They went to church. They were really understood the faith and lived the faith. Their two boys, on the other hand, they said they were two little demons, is what people called them. And so Vincent's job was to come and tutor these two little demons. But as he came into their house and he lived there, and of course they had servants and all sorts of people like that, both the Count and the Countess, it started affecting them being around him. They just like, this guy, there's something special about this guy. Their faith started growing even deeper. Do you have a question? Yes.
Why did they call them?
Why did they call him what?
Why did they call them?
I can't hear you.
Why did he call them the two little demons?
Because they were really naughty. They weren't listening to anybody, and they were just really bad. So anyway, Vincent wasn't getting anywhere with the kids, but the parents were growing deeper and deeper in their faith. So much so that there was a couple of events that happened. One is that the wife, the Countess, she would hear Vincent talk about his love of wanting to serve the poor and wanting to serve those who were ill and kind of the outcasts of society. Remember, these people are like, they're really high on the hog. They got a big mansion, and they've got like summer homes and all this type of thing. And there's all these people that are basically lining the streets that are just ill and poor and sick. And the woman, she's falling in love with this idea about serving the poor. And so they're at this summer home of theirs once, and they had these peasant farmers that worked for them to kind of help with the estate. And one of them fell sick. and she asked Vincent to go to, Father Vincent at this point, to go to his side and to be with him if he was going to die. And after talking with him, Father Vincent said, I really feel like you just need to make a general confession and just set things right with God. And he does. And there was things, he was steeped in mortal sin. He was a pretty good Christian, but there was a lot of things that he was doing that were wrong. And so he made this general confession, and then the Countess went and visited him, and he says, if it weren't for you sending Father Vincent, my soul would have been eternally damned to hell, because I wouldn't have confessed these sins, and I didn't feel like I could until he came here. And so the Countess was like, this is so awesome. And she told Vincent, she says, you need to talk to everybody about this. And so at his next Sunday Mass, he preached on confession. And he said the lines were so long for confession after Mass, and next day that Vincent couldn't keep up, and he had to go find another priest to hear the confessions. It was just like there was this hunger for what he had to say. And there was this, when people got around him, they were just like, they were changed. And we talked about a couple other saints like that. In one of the areas where he lived earlier on, there was somebody that was in town that was like that. He was, again, kind of like the bad boy in town, and he lived kind of a raucous lifestyle. And he was kind of like, I'm going to check this guy out. And he walks up to him and basically falls on his knees, says, Father, forgive me, I'm a sinner. And he basically kind of like story in the Bible of Zacchaeus, where he says, if I've defrauded anybody, I'm going to give money back. He starts giving away all his possessions. He's got like this estate, and he was going to sell it, and Vincent says, no, don't sell it. He's like, why? So he opens a hospital and a hospice and a place for the poor and the sick to come in this estate where this guy lived. And this guy insisted on being one of the ones to serve them. And then he died shortly after that, and he died a very pious death because he just got around Vincent, and all the garbage fell away, and he just crumbled, and he became the person that God wanted him to be, and he repented of all of his sin. So anyway, so the Countess was she didn't want Vincent to ever leave. She wanted him to be there to counsel the servants, to continue to work with the boys, but the boys just weren't getting it. The boys were just getting worse. And this was really frustrating Vincent. Well, one day, so this Count, the husband, he was, one of the things that was big at the time was dueling, with swords or with pistols, and he was big into this. And Vincent found out one day that he was about to go into a duel, and he went to him and he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, he says, the Lord doesn't want you to do this, and if you don't listen, you're going to die an unrepentant death. And he was really taken aback by this. He said, okay, and this is a big deal to back out of a duel. So Vincent had a very profound effect on both the Count and the Countess. But as I said, the boys, they just weren't getting it. And Vincent was like, I'm not having any luck with this here. And it was apparent to him, at least, that he was not the one to be the tutor for these boys. And so he went back to Father de Paul, and he said, I really would like to move on from here. And so he was assigned to a parish. And he went to that parish, and it was a parish in disrepair. So as I mentioned earlier, that sometimes the priests were not well formed, and they were in it for the money, right? And so that was definitely the case here, is that there were some other priests there, and they weren't in good shape spiritually. And so he worked with them to bring them back up to par, but also the church itself just needed a lot of work. It was just in disrepair, and so he worked on that. And so what happened was that, when he came to town, people, they kind of took notice that he was here. And there was a young man who was in town who Father was going to live with him. And so he, didn't really, he didn't have much of a faith. He was a Catholic, but he didn't have much of a faith, and people knew this. Well, after a time, all of a sudden, he gradually started changing, and people started noticing that there was something different, and there was something about this priest. And so there was one day when there was some poor people came, and they were looking for some, for a handout. And some of the ladies from the church saw this, and so they said to Father. He said, we need to give him something. So Father preached on this at Mass. And later that afternoon, there was tons of people that showed up with something to give the poor people. And so he realized that there was not a lack of resources to give to the poor. What it lacked is organization. And so what had happened is there was a couple of the ladies that were pretty well off that, after he had been there a little bit, they realized that there was just more to life than some of the things that, the high class types of activities that they were used to. And they suddenly became more engaged at Mass because whether they were getting more out of it, or again, like we said, there's something about this Father Vincent. And they approached Father and they said, we can help, and so they started diverting resources. And so Father started this group called the Ladies of Charity. And so these were lay people. They were usually well off, or at least they were willing to help. They weren't necessarily all upper class people, but they were willing to help. And they were just they just wanted to get in there and do it. And these were people that were not used to working with their hands and kind of getting dirty with stuff, but they were the ones that wanted to go in there and help the sick. They were the ones that wanted to go in there and care for the orphans. And there was I want to find here it is right here. This is what the association, this is the guidelines that they went by, and this is for the Ladies of Charity. It says the association was to be under the management of the curé of the parish, the priest of the parish, the pastor, and every good woman might belong to it. Its members were to devote themselves to the service of the poor for the love of our Lord Jesus Christ, their patron. They were to tend the sick cheerfully and kindly as they would their own children, not disdaining to minister to them with their own hands. So again, there was times when there were people with contagious diseases, and they were like, no, I want to be the one to help. And so he had no shortage of volunteers, no shortage of resources to make this happen. And so this expanded and grew. And so not only was it lay people, but eventually there was an order of sisters that formed around this called the Sisters of Charity. And they started helping out in the areas, and this started spreading through France. Not only the sisters, but the Ladies of Charity. This started spreading throughout France, and they were known as the Gray Sisters. The nuns were, because of the color of their habits. They were kind of termed the Gray Sisters. So after this got going, the Count and the Countess had kind of thought that Vincent was gone for a short time, but they were becoming aware that this was a permanent move, and they really wanted him back, not just because of tutoring their boys, because they said if the tutoring is the problem, we'll bring in another tutor, and you can oversee the tutor, but we need you back here. We want you to, because we believe you can help us. And so they talked to this Father de Barul, and he agreed with them. And so out of obedience, he sends Father Vincent, back to the Count and the Countess. And, it said in the book, it said, Father Vincent, not being so proud that he couldn't admit that he might be wrong, went and he said, okay, well, I'll give this another try. And so he goes, and one of the things that the Count was in charge of was the Navy. And so in those days, there were two ways that a ship would travel. One would be by wind, which is the most common way, but they also had, in some ships, especially warships, because they couldn't always rely on the wind, they would have galley slaves. And so what these were people that were prisoners usually, and they would be the ones that were in the bottom of the boat. You've probably seen these movies where there's people with the big oars and they're down there and they're kind of chained to the benches, and their job was basically to row the boat. And there was dozens of these men down in the bowels of the boat, and the conditions were just horrible. And so Vincent became aware of these galley prisoners, and so he went to visit them once, and he was absolutely appalled at the conditions that he saw. He saw that the quarters where they lived at, they were basically chained up. There was vermin, there was rats, they were hardly given any food. There were prisoners that would just kill themselves because the conditions were so horrible. And he went to the Count, and with tears in his eyes, he says, don't you understand? You're going to be responsible for this when you face our Lord someday. And the Count was truly shocked, because he's like, I didn't realize. He says, these men are prisoners. We treated them as prisoners and slaves. But, you know, he said he didn't make the connection. Vincent said, no, you're going to be responsible for these men when you go face our Lord. And so immediately they started diverting some money to the care of these prisoners. You know, they were still prisoners, but they improved the conditions where they were. They, you know, they had wounds all over themselves, and they made their conditions at least tolerable, despite, you know, the job that they still had to do. Another thing that happened to Vincent is that there was one day when he was walking through the town, and he noticed that there was a man with this child, and he saw the man beating up the child, and he was harming the child. And so he took the child away from the man. Well, what this man was, he was a beggar, and sometimes these beggars in town, they would get a child, they would steal a child, or they would buy them from an orphanage, and then they would abuse them so they look worse than they were to begin with, so that they could walk through the town and make it look like their condition was worse, and people would give them more money. And I know that just sounds awful, and it is. It's terrible. But that's what people did. This is how desperate the times were for a lot of people. So Vincent saw that. He's like, no, this is not on my watch. And he took the child, and he went to one of the orphanages in town there, and he was appalled at what he saw there. He walked in, and the conditions there were just absolutely horrible. The women taking care of the orphans, you know, they were mean to them. The conditions were terrible. They were giving them drugs to keep them from crying, and they were just like little babies. And they were giving them drugs to do that. They would sell them for 1 franc to whoever wanted them, basically like this beggar who had the child and was abusing it so that he could get more money. They were selling these children. And so Vincent, again, like, not on my watch, this is not going to happen. So he took a couple of the children with him, and he went to some of his sisters, and they were like, no, we'll do this. And so they started setting up this orphanage, and they wound up, at some point, I don't know if it was immediately, but they wound up like 400 kids, and they were taking care of these children. And it was such a blessing to Vincent, because during his time when he was doing all this, you know, you can't go out and work with the conditions that he did and have it not affect you, right? He was very humble, but he didn't complain about it a lot, but this was affecting him. And so there's a really good quote in here that said, he said, he came across much that was neither innocent nor attractive in his dealings with the world. He was one who never judged harshly, and who could always see in the man, however depraved, the image of his maker. Yet the innocence and purity of his own soul found their best solace in the company of these little creatures whom he had rescued from a double death. They were his recreation in the moments of depression, which all who work for the welfare of mankind must experience. And so this was affecting him. And, you know, to deal with that day in and day out, you know, it really wore on him. And so they started this foundling hospital. They called it the foundling hospital because the foundlings were the children that they found. And again, this idea started spreading around France. And so, so there was just all these just wonderful works that were happening in his hands, and it was just the circumstances that he saw, and he would just deal with them. And he had these ways, and there was people that were just flocking to his ideas because, again, he had this air about him, and he called them schemes, right? He had this scheme for what he was going to do. Usually we think of a scheme as a bad thing, but it was basically his idea, his plan of how to get this done, and the things happened. And the people, he had, you know, for a while, he had no problem with money for a lot of these things. However, this is also during the time of the 30 Years' War, which went from 1618 to 1648. And so towards the end, I mean, France was more involved in the war, and so this was really starting to wear on their finances as a nation. And so now most of the fighting was going on in Germany, but it was like the eastern provinces, northeastern provinces of France that were involved. But they were wanting to send sisters and help to these areas, but they found that their resources were getting spread more and more thin. And they found that if they were going to send resources to these areas that had a lot of, you know, orphans because of the war, a lot of people that were injured, a lot of people, you know, just a lot of need up there. If they're going to do that, they were going to have to take money from things like the Foundling Hospital. And Vincent's just like, we can't take money from the Foundling Hospital, but we need to do something. And so he wound up printing up these leaflets Again, this is in the 1600s. Not a lot of newspapers, not a lot of ways that news gets around. It's not like today. And started getting word out, and people started hearing about what was going on and what they were trying to do. And more people started getting involved, not only monetarily, but more people wanted to get involved to help. And so this kind of gave him a little bit of an income, not for himself, but to do some of the things that needed to be done with the ideas that he had. And so again, this is like normal for him, where just all these things would happen, and he found a way to make it all work. Another big thing that's worth mentioning that was going on at the time, and I don't know if we talked about it much, but at times throughout the church, there's been different heresies that have happened, and there's a bunch of different ones where basically some of the teachings of the church, somebody comes up with an idea that's not quite right, and they kind of go off the rails with this teaching. Well, this is what happened with something called Jansenism, and this was prevalent around this time. And without getting into all the details of it, Jansenism basically is, there's a part of it with predestination, and basically they were saying that Christ did not come to save everybody. He just came to save some people, and the rest of them were not going to make it to heaven no matter what they did, that they couldn't respond to the grace that was given them. And so that's not true at all. We all have grace that God wants to give us, and God wants us all to be saved. We know that for a fact. The other thing that they did is that they said that the sacraments are so holy, and they weren't entirely wrong in this. The sacraments are very holy, but they said that the sacraments are so holy that we are not worthy to even approach them. And so even, certainly the lay people and even priests, they're just so holy that we shouldn't be, receiving the Eucharist, receiving confession. And that's wrong too, because Christ, even though we aren't worthy, we are not worthy, right, for heaven, but God wants us there with him so badly. He's created these ways for us to get there. The Eucharist, spiritual food for our soul. Confession, a way for us to reconcile ourselves with God. The sacraments are all encounters with God. They are very holy, but not so holy that we should not approach them and approach them regularly. And so Vincent was very adamant about this, and when he kind of learned more about what it was, this was affecting a lot of the people that he was dealing with. A lot of the poor, basically, they were saying that they're not going to make it anyway, and that's just not the way to think. And so, what he basically said is, he said, the rule of our mission priests lays down that one of the principal points of our mission is to inspire others to receive the sacraments of penance and of the Eucharist frequently and worthily. The teaching of the Jansenists sought, on the contrary, to inspire such awe in the sacraments that neither priests nor people would dare to approach them save at very rare intervals. It was the great mass of the people, poor, simple, and suffering, those children of God whom Vincent loved, and in whose service the whole of his life has been spent, whose salvation was in danger. It was against them that the Jansenists were shutting the doors of salvation. So he stood up, and he stood up strongly against the Jansenists. And he had such an influence among people. This was one of the turning points of the Jansenist, not revolt, but the Jansenist heresy. And so people were kind of like, well, if Vincent's against it, probably not a good thing. And so he was having influence over people. And so the Jansenists, especially a couple people that were originally from his order, the ones that Father de Barul started this oratory, there were some people from that were some of the big leaders of this. And so they did not like Father Vincent at all, because he was kind of derailing what they were trying to do. And again, a lot of times with these heresies, I shouldn't say always, but sometimes people aren't doing it out of malice. They're like, no, we really believe this, and so they want to spread it, like we do with our Catholicism. Our job is to evangelize others, is to be disciples for Christ. And so that's what they were doing, and they just had this significant misunderstanding of what the gospel really is. And unfortunately, it spreads, and then that pulls people away from salvation. So that's why these heresies can be really dangerous. So, the end of his life, he becomes more and more sickly. He was having problems. They said his legs and his feet were so swollen that he could barely walk. He was on crutches, but he didn't want anybody to help him, so he would still do his best. He got to the point where towards the very end of his life, he couldn't even say Mass anymore. He could attend Mass, but he couldn't say Mass because he just was too handicapped to be able to do it. He just physically could not do it. And so some of the people that he was being tended to by, they were like, well, we'll provide you with a carriage, and he didn't want that. He was like, no, that's not something I want. Well, they insisted, and out of obedience, he would use it, but then he would have the carriage go down and pick up some poor people, and he would interact with them. He would have, he would go down and get people and take them to Mass. He would do different things like that. But he lived to be about 79 years old, and for most of us, that's, we have grandparents that are older than that. In these days, not a lot of people lived that long. Most people, were probably in their 50s, 60s, 70s when they died, and he lived to be 79. But he lived a full life. He was in the service of the poor and the crippled and the sick and the orphans and the widows. I mean, he was all the things that wrapped into one of who Christ calls all of us to be, and he inspired many people to follow him. And so he died in 1660, September 27, 1660. Probably about, he was beatified in 1729, so what's that, 70 years later. Canonized just a short time after that, in 1737. And so he was looked upon, for his charity to the poor and all the things that he did. Now, we all know about the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and he actually didn't start that, right? He inspired it. And so in 1833, a gentleman who's actually now a blessed, Frederick Orzenam, was a college student in France. And they had a group of college students, and they would have these discussion groups, as happens in college. And they had people of different viewpoints, and they were talking about saints like St. Vincent de Paul and all the great things that they did. And some of the students challenged him, and they said, yes, your Catholic faith has done lots of great things in the past, but what have you done lately? And this kind of convicted them. They were like, there are some good things going on, but they then, Frederick was kind of the leader. They decided to start something which eventually became what we now know as the St. Vincent de Paul Society. He took the inspiration from the life of St. Vincent de Paul and applied that to what they were going to do with it. And so they were feeding the hungry, they were clothing the naked, they were doing all these spiritual and corporal works of mercy. They were working on doing these in a real way, and this caught fire. And I think within a short time they were in like every nation in Europe, and they were starting to spread around the globe. And so, like I said, so the winter clothing drive that we were a part of, just last month, or in November and December, that was St. Vincent de Paul Society. They're doing lots of different things to meet the needs of people. And so we all know, of course, of the St. Vincent de Paul Society stores that are around. And it's almost second nature to us, to take the things that we no longer need, that are still in usable condition, to give them to places like Goodwill, which is a whole different idea. But St. Vincent de Paul, it's like, hey, let's take the stuff to St. Vinny's. And so we pack up the things we need, and so then they can sell that, and then they use the money for their ministry to do the things they need to do. And a story of how I personally saw the types of things that they do that I wouldn't have known about had I not asked is, as you know, I work at Quick Trip, just part-time, just a little bit of extra spending money and pay some bills. And there was a gentleman there, and he was going to be an assistant store lead. And he had come to start working there. His name was Brian. Really nice guy. Really, late 20s, really happy guy. And by the time he had been there about 6-8 weeks, suddenly he got to the point where he couldn't work anymore. He was pretty overweight, and he was a really big dude. And he was having some significant problems with his knees, and he could no longer, even though he was sitting in a chair, he could no longer even do that. And so anyway, so he was going to go on disability. And his wife was at home homeschooling their 2 children. And so there was a point there, and this is like right before Christmas last year. So November, December of 2020. And they were going to get evicted from their apartment. And I said, you can't get evicted from your apartment. The law won't allow it, but they were still going to get evicted because there was still that COVID law in place about you can't evict people from their apartments. So anyway, it was going to happen. And he says, he comes to me, and we had stayed in touch. And there was something he always said, he says, I always felt like I could talk with you about stuff. He was born Catholic, but he wasn't really raised Catholic. And he got confirmed when he was 18, and he was really kind of and he kind of fell away again. And now he's kind of starting to realize that his faith was calling him back. And I was getting to the point where I was going to start inviting him to stuff. And then he had to go on disability. Well, there was this gap where the disability hadn't kicked in yet, and so they had no income. He says, Steve, is there anything you know that you can help? And I said, well, I can find out. And I asked our parish here, and they said, well, check with St. Vincent de Paul. And I did. I called our somebody here that works for St. Vincent de Paul as a volunteer, and she's very involved with them. And she said, well, let me check. I'm sure there's something we could do. And they wound up covering the part of their rent that they could not cover, for that month or two. So they didn't get evicted until his disability kicked in. And so they want to help anybody. It's not like you have to be, super poor, or you have to be an orphan. They're like, you need help, and like, especially this short-term thing, we're there to help you out. And that's awesome. That's the spirit of what St. Vincent de Paul, that's the spirit of what this man did for, not only for our church, but for our world. Is he, there certainly are other saints that had this, but this man had a passion for it. And he just, made this happen. So anyway, any questions?